Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Kindly accept my sincere apologies for not being able to join you at this esteemed conference, but I'm happy to share with you my part of the presentation. I must say I was a little bit harassed when I noticed that I have to be on a panel with all professors, and I'm only still a miss. I'm grateful that the university upgraded me to a missus, but I can't be married to my father. Nonetheless, let's get into the presentation. So my piece is about Ubuntu, the spirit at work. I think as South Africans, and particularly as industrial psychologists, we talk about this word Ubuntu quite often without the full understanding of what it means and what it means to our audiences as well. And particularly if we're talking about research, I mean, a lot of work has been done and written about Ubuntu. You go the world over and people are talking about Ubuntu. We just haven't quite looked at the mirror right here at home in terms of what it means and what it would particularly mean in the workplace. So my piece is really about looking into Ubuntu and thinking about which areas we will need to focus on in terms of research to bring this point home and make it very relevant to our audiences right here in South Africa. So I'm going to take you through, just a greeting and a context, and I'll talk to it when I get to it. It's called How Are the Children? The diagnosis where we're currently sitting at as a country, as well as the legislative framework, how Ubuntu is defined, and just the spirit at work, what it would mean for a normal indigenous South African, and what therefore our response ability is. We have an ability to respond, so that's not a spelling mistake at all. And unfortunately, I will not be here to take questions, but if there are any questions, I'm sure they can be referred via Prof. Rothman, and I'll be happy to answer them. So how are the children? And I'm asking this question 24 years later. As you can see in my slide there, we have the Maasai warriors, and we're told that the Maasai of Kenya, actually, when they greet each other, in all their warriorship, they always ask a basic question which says, how are the children? And the essence of that question is basically around the future. They are asking about the future of their tribe. Are the children well looked after? And I've looked at some of the, the issues we're grappling with 24 years into democracy. We're talking land ownership. We have the biggest inequality. We have economic freedom being bandied around. Youth graduate employment or unemployment is on the high. We actually have an association for unemployed youth. The advent of consumerism, where all our kids want is to consume and consume without any, regard in terms of how they can be part of the production and part of the economy at large. Cultural shame, excessive corruption. We've had so many cases of just blatant racism. At one point, one would think that people are doing it just to get popular because it can't be that blatant. Femicide is on the increase. We're killing our women, and poor service delivery everywhere. We even used to the service delivery protests that we have as a country. We are now in a country where the history as it is what one would call the master's history. The history is not representative of the full story of what happened in South Africa, and we continue to bandy that. Rogue religion. In the past few years, we've seen pastors who make people drink petrol, so that they can be saved, or spray them with doom. The advent of violent crime, and I mean, it happens now even in public. We're not safe anywhere as a country. All of this, have led us to question the quality of education, right through from primary school education, and now through the fees must fall, we're now talking more about decolonizing the curriculum and making it more relevant. And all of that has to be done within a volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous environment, as well as the fourth industrial revolution that we talk about so much. And what I've really gone and done is spoken to a lot of people and said, if we were to diagnose the state our country is in, particularly the socio-economic state, we would say it has a collective, continuous, post-traumatic stress disorder. And a young gentleman who I sit with in one of the university advisory boards actually said he thinks we are in a deep depression as a country. So how are the children 24 years later? If we look at where we are at the moment, where it feels like things are not working, One would say that we have a system failure in the matrix. And when the system is down, obviously it affects people mentally as well. And we know anything that is impacted upon mentally gets to be impacted in terms of how we behave and what we feel and what we eventually do, not only to ourselves, but to each other as well. Hence the call for Ubuntu and probably thinking about what it means in the workplace. All right, so if you ask about Ubuntu, is there a legislative framework around it? Yes, of course there is. I mean, the Constitution of the Republic, you know, the values or the value base of the Constitution is around Ubuntu. The Bill of Responsibilities, I actually found this out recently, that the Department of Basic Education encourages Ubuntu through this Bill of Responsibilities, which means that children should be taught about Ubuntu at an early age. The preamble of the 2011 White Paper on Southern African Foreign Policy in terms of how we relate to the rest of the SADC region is based on Ubuntu. The Batho Pele or People First principles in the civil service were based on Ubuntu. The Truth Reconciliation Commission as well, the Moral Regeneration Movement, and right there in South African Code of Arms, where it says diverse people unite, it talks about Ubuntu. And one would ask, if this is so embedded, you know, why is it not happening? Why are we not seeing Ubuntu in action 24 years down the line? Further to the legislative framework around Ubuntu, if one looks at the indigenous knowledge system, we have a whole lot of legislation, and I'm not going to go through all of them, perhaps except for the indigenous knowledge system policy of 2004, as well as the indigenous knowledge systems or traditional knowledge bill of 2016. We're still debating what it is going to be called, so we don't know what it is going to be called. I'm singling out those two because not only do they you know, acknowledge or not only do all the legislation acknowledge the framework which talks to more traditional cultural belief systems, but these two in particular promote the use of indigenous knowledge system and, you know, everywhere in society, including in the workplace as well. So it is important to understand that there is a legislative framework that supports that. And I know your eyes are probably looking at the Witchcraft legislation and Traditional and Allied Health Professions Act. All of this is part of the diversity that we have in our society. Actually, there is research that shows that 80% of South Africans, be they Christian or not, they still consult traditional healers or alternative healers for that particular instance, which makes it even easier for us to introduce Ubuntu at an indigenous knowledge system level. So let's define Ubuntu. We've broken down the two words. Ubu, part of Ubuntu, means the indispensable part of the lived experience, which manifests through our relationships with other people. So it's about you becoming human, which cannot be about you as an individual, but it's about how your humanity interacts with other people's humanity. And then two, part of it is often defined as the causative force, the godliness, the beingness, the spirit, the human spirit, whatever it is that keeps us alive and leaves our bodies when we die, would then be then two aspects of it. So for me, what's important is just that last line under two that says universal resemblance, which says to us that's the one part that all humans have in common, and it brings us together. All of us are the same through the spirit that lives within us. So again, defining Ubuntu not only through the generous or the usual definitions of I am because you are, or you need me for us to be one and we should be one. That's very generic. This is about the universal resemblance in humanity. So Ubuntu, therefore, is both a state of being and one of becoming, and it's a process of self-realization, which does not only happen with you as an individual, but it happens through other people as well. So to know that you are human, you have to identify with other humans, and in that way you can confirm your humanity. We've looked at quite some of the reading around Ubuntu that we have in the country, and one that caught my eye was Mbigi and Maria, where they talk about the key values of Ubuntu. Being group solidarity, conformity, compassion, respect, human dignity, and collective unity. A.E. Donker actually contextualized it and said the individual is not a physical being, but a spiritual and divine individual who lives with other human beings. Again, you know, kind of emphasizing that definition of Ubuntu. And Vim Sila says it's about sacrificing for others selflessly and caring for and protecting fellow human beings. if you look at this, it sounds very general, but it's these humans that walk into the workplace. It's these humans that interact with each other. And as industrial psychologists, we looked at the individual, how that individual interacts in the team, and how the teams collectively work towards achieving the organizational vision. We also say that an effective employee has to have those three things in check. They need to have personal mastery, and that would, for me, would be the base for Ubuntu. Technical expertise, which is the skills and the knowledge, and also knowledge of the business or the industry in which they operate. So if we zoom into the personal mastery aspect of it, that is where really Ubuntu lies. And we know that if people do not understand their strengths, their weaknesses, and they do not have a path in terms of how they become more effective, not only as human beings, but as employees as well, we know that they cannot be effective. So if you look at the individual in terms of Ubuntu, what do they need to have? They need to have an identity. You know, this could be a cultural identity as well, a level of spirituality, justice, fairness, respect, reciprocity, knowing that whatever they give, you know, they should also receive. Loving kindness, compassion, attentiveness, responsiveness, and sharing. If you look at all of these qualities as well, this is what we need people to bring into the workplace. What I like about Maria and Biggie is that they took it further and they said, let's look at the various levels of spirit in an African traditional, and particularly Southern African traditional knowledge you know, perspective. And they kind of likened it to the various qualities that we would expect at work. And I like comparing the two. It's called the Dembe-Tembe model, where they say the lowest level is that of you know, where somebody has a witch spirit, and any African would know about this, you know. So these people that are cynics, are negative, they're full of destruction, and they bring that sort of energy in the workplace, they'll be at that level. We've got the avenging spirit, you know, which is driven by bitterness, anger, and revenge. And we're beginning to see a lot of that in the workplace as well, where people believe, you know, they're entitled to certain things, and if they don't get them, they go into anger and revenge, all the violence that has been happening in the workplace. The wandering spirit is the spirit of creativity or having a particular obsession. So if it's a particular obsession, it can be negative in the workplace because this person wants to do just one thing, whereas the spirit of creativity is welcomed, particularly in light with the fourth industrial revolution. The family spirit are the people who look at the survival of self and the survival of team. So you can imagine a supervisor and his small team and them working together and, you know, emphasizing more team unity or team cohesion over anything. The war spirit, also called Majukwa, is that of power and conflict. We're seeing a lot of that now where people rise. And I mean, if you look at the political space, for example, in South Africa, where we're now talking factions and, you know, people want power. And because of that fight for power, there's a lot of conflict. That would be likened to the spirit of Majukwa. The divination spirit, the spirit of authority and truth, probably what we need more than anything in most of our workplaces, where people take responsibility, take accountability, are honest and truthful, and probably practice what we call authentic leadership. The hunter spirit, the Mushavi spirit, probably maybe the highest level of where we would want an employee to be. And by the way, these spirits are kind of cumulative. It's like going up a ladder. That's where the spirit of performance and enterprise lies. So we want more Mushavis or more hunter spirits in the workplace. And the question is, how do we cultivate that? And then right at the top is the rainmaker spirit. And I think this is my favorite. Not only does it look at morality and dignity, if you look at the rainmaker concept, when rain falls, it falls on everybody. Rain looks at, you know, how can I bless this part of land or this parched part of land so that something can grow out of it and the land can be productive. So imagine if we had rainmaker type of leaders who not only look at, you know, we have this thing in the workplace where we say if people are not working properly, we manage them out of the organization. A rainmaker spirit wouldn't do that because rain falls on all people alike, whether they are sinners or criminals or, you know, they are good human beings. It falls on all people alike. And the impact there is to say, let's give dignity because, you know, people do things that they're not supposed to do, you know, in life, but let us build them up. Let us, you know, have the rain fall on them so that we can build them up as individuals. So it looks for that small little good that is left within the individual and builds them up to be the best person that they can be. So if you look at this spirit and you look at the fact that I know the names that he used, they are particularly from Zimbabwe, which is part of Southern Africa, and a lot of them relate to the languages that are used in our country, in South Africa. If we went into that type of research and started speaking this type of language in the workplace, for me, that is how we are going to bring the spirit at work. I recently went to a conference in the US where they study African psychology. They've been doing that since 1968, so that's about 50 years of research that they have. And what is interesting about that is that in their 4th year, they actually come to the continent. They even come to South Africa. They'll tell you, no, we go deep into Limpopo, we go to Mapungubwe, we go to Venda, and we sit there and we see how people cope from an indigenous knowledge base. And they've written books and upon books of this information about us. And my challenge is always, there we go again, we're going to read about ourselves from somebody else's perspective. And to all the researchers out there, my stance then becomes, let's go out and study our own people. Some of this information that we require is right at our doorsteps. We don't need to be reading about it from somebody else's perspective who is outside of our space. We need to be packaging and shipping this information out. And one of the other things that comes up in terms of this research is the 5 P's of Ubuntu by our very own Professor V. Msila. And he says when you have all those 5 principles, again, you are then able to bring the spirit of Ubuntu alive. People-centeredness, we all know what it means. My favorite one there is the permeable walls, allowing for open communication in our workplaces, allowing for celebrated diversity in our workplaces. Partisanship, creating a spirit where people can be loyal, or an environment where people can be loyal, and there's freedom of association. And in this case, not freedom of association, because I have to, or because this is where I earn my living, but freedom of association because people want to be there and they see this vision and they need to speak in one voice as South Africans. The progeny, collective decision making, involving staff at all levels when we're deciding about the future, the strategy. When I do my OD work, I go and I say, I want a full representative spectrum of this organization at the strategic planning session, because you need insights from everybody at the various levels in the organization to be able to decide on a way forward. This top-down approach, as we know, is not sustainable. Production as well. Imagine a South Africa where we all prosperous in a very conducive environment as well. I mean, all of these are the 5 P's of Ubuntu, and if we have all of these in check, of course, we will have a workplace that is productive, that is effective, that contributes towards the economic growth that we so need as a country. And how do we move forward? And that's our responsibility. Our responsibility is that we move from a fixed mindset to a growth mindset. And a growth mindset embraces challenges, it persists in obstacles, it sees effort as necessary. So it might look like a daunting task to go and look for research out in Limpopo, in Venda, or deep in the rural Eastern Cape. But if we see the need for it and we understand that it is important, that we start to create a body of knowledge that is relevant to the majority of the population, or to the majority of our audiences that we are producing research for, then we take pride in our work. We become more relevant because we can see an impact that we make as industrial psychologists. Growth mindset also learns from criticism. Of course, things have not been done properly in the end, but every day is an opportunity for a new beginning. And my point is that that's where we need to move from. Let's take what we did wrong, acknowledge it, and move forward. A growth mindset is also inspired by other success. So let's look at people that have done this well, and let's see how they've gone back and really looked at, how things work, at the grassroots level in our various communities, and let's be inspired by them and learn from them in terms of research and in that space. And my call in closure is that my humanity is bound up in yours, for we can only be human together. And this was from Desmond Tutu. Thank you.